In 2003, a historic countryside chapel reopened after years of disuse, drawing quiet celebration from the devout community that had waited patiently. But just days after the bishop's blessing, painters assigned to restore the sanctuary uncovered something chilling beneath the old wooden floorboards. Fresh blood, still warm. No one had entered the church overnight. What followed unraveled a forgotten past the church never intended to face, and a truth buried beneath decades of silence. The sun hung low in the afternoon sky, casting long golden beams through the towering pines surrounding St. Irenaeus Chapel. Tucked deep within the rural outskirts of Glendale County, the church had stood in silence for over 5 decades, its doors sealed, its stained glass darkened by layers of dust and time. Few locals remembered when it had been shut down. Official records listed structural instability as the cause, but rumors, those quiet, stubborn things, whispered of a far older, deeper fear. This year, the diocese had approved a complete restoration of the chapel. It was to be reopened as part of a spiritual revitalization effort across the county, a way to bring light back into forgotten corners, as the Archbishop had said during the blessing campaign. Teams of craftsmen, architects, and volunteers had been working for months to bring the structure back to life. Every beam was sanded and restored, every piece of glass meticulously cleaned or replaced. Even the bell tower, once rumored to have been struck by lightning, was fortified and blessed with holy oil. Bishop Thomas Adley had personally overseen the project's final days. Now, in his early 70s, the bishop had served the church faithfully for over 5 decades. His presence commanded reverence, yet his eyes carried the weight of old memories. No one knew that he had once served in St. Irenaeus as a boy, an altar server, back when the chapel was still alive with prayer and incense. That detail remained locked away in the quiet of his conscience. The reopening ceremony drew hundreds. Faithful parish Youngerists, journalists, curious locals, even skeptics, all gathered beneath the chapel's newly repainted archways. Inside, everything gleamed. Candles were lit. The organ played solemn hymns. The scent of frankincense drifted through the air, lacing the wood and stone with sacred intention. As the procession began, Bishop Adley walked slowly down the center aisle, flanked by deacons and priests in white and gold vestments. His voice was steady as he recited prayers, sprinkling holy water along the pews, at the baptismal font, across the altar. The atmosphere was solemn, the energy reverent, but for those who paid attention, something about the bishop's pace seemed hesitant. His eyes often drifted toward the corners of the chapel, as if seeing things no one else could. When the moment came to bless the central crucifix, an aged, ornate cross recovered from the chapel's catacombs and painstakingly restored, the bishop stepped forward with trembling hands. The crucifix had been found by workers while clearing debris beneath the altar weeks before. Though covered in dust and corrosion, the image of Christ remained surprisingly intact, the carved features striking in detail. Several restorers had noted an odd discomfort when handling it, but none had dared voice it aloud. Bishop Adley raised the aspergillum, dipped it into the silver bowl of holy water, and whispered the ancient Latin rite. As he touched the base of the crucifix, his eyes widened. His mouth opened as if to speak, then, with a sharp, sickening sound, his body crumpled to the floor. A collective gasp swept through the crowd. The deacons rushed to his side. Some called for an ambulance. The organ fell silent. For a long moment, time itself seemed to pause inside the chapel. Paramedics arrived within minutes and carefully moved the bishop to a stretcher. His pulse was weak but present. Before losing consciousness entirely, he managed to whisper one phrase, barely audible to the young priest kneeling beside him. "It remembers." Those 2 words were enough to send ripples of unease through the clergy. They had no context, no precedent, but something about the tone, part dread, part reverence, stayed with them. The ceremony ended in confusion. Parishioners filtered out, murmuring. Their confirmed journalists clutched their notebooks with renewed interest. But the deacons and priests, especially Father Nolan, the young clerk who had heard the bishop's final words, remained behind. That evening, while the crowd dispersed and the bishop was stabilized at the hospital, Father Nolan returned to the chapel. It was nearly dark when he stood alone before the crucifix. The candles flickered softly, the shadows danced along the marble floor. With a heavy heart, he knelt and began to pray. He didn't hear the whisper behind him. He didn't see the reflection shift in the glass window. But something unseen, had stirred. The next morning, under a pale gray sky still heavy with last night's rain, the chapel stood eerily quiet. Father Nolan arrived early, walking alone through the gravel path with a thermos of black coffee in one hand and his rosary clutched in the other. The events of the previous day, especially the bishop's sudden collapse, lingered in his mind like smoke after incense. He had hardly slept. Those words, "it remembers," kept replaying in his thoughts, echoing against memories he didn't know he had. Inside, the chapel smelled faintly of oil and pine dust, the aftermath of weeks of sanding, varnishing, and paintwork. A crew of 5 painters were already at work, touching up the interior panels and inspecting the decorative moldings. One of them, a seasoned man, Naver Park Moldings, Naver Patch of Workworks, had shown signs of warping. He had planned to replace the panel completely before finishing the coat, but as he pried it up, something caught his attention. An odd discoloration on the underside of the plank. It was a deep, rust-colored stain, irregular and matte. Curious, he lifted another plank, then another. The third one came up with a wet sucking sound, and a strong metallic scent filled the air. Cal recoiled, dropping the board with a muscle thud. Beneath, nestled between the subfloor slats, was a sticky, red-black smear that shimmered faintly under the beam of his flashlight. And it wasn't dry. "Hey!" he called out, voice wavering. "Can someone get over here?" Another painter, Lena, hurried over, expecting perhaps a mouse or water damage, but when she saw the glistening pool under the wood, her face blanched. "That looks like blood," she whispered, "but fresh." Cal wiped his gloves against his pants, breath hitching. "It's warm," he muttered. "It shouldn't be warm." They all stood there for a moment in stunned silence. No one moved. The building creaked softly in the distance, a sound like settling beams or perhaps something older stretching its limbs. Father Nolan, who had been in the sacristy organizing hymnals, heard the commotion and approached. When he saw the painters' expressions and the open floorboards, he froze. Kneeling beside them, he instinctively made the sign of the cross before asking, "Has anyone touched it?" "No, Father. We just found it. It's not natural." Nolan leaned closer, his brow furrowed. He wasn't trained in forensics, but he had seen blood before, at hospitals, in emergencies, even in confessionals when someone came seeking solace after violence. This wasn't like that. This felt wrong. A silence fell among the group until one of the younger workers, Mateo, shifted uncomfortably. "Father," he said cautiously, "there's something else. Over there," he pointed toward the far corner of the nave, where a section of plaster had been removed to expose the original brick. Mateo had been working on stripping old paint from decorative molding when a hairline crack in the wall revealed a narrow cavity, almost like a message had been tucked away. Curious, he had removed the plaster carefully, revealing an uneven patch of stone. On it, scribbled in faded but legible strokes, was a line of Latin text, Domus non oblita est. Father Nolan approached the writing slowly. He reached out but didn't touch it, as if afraid the message might vanish. He whispered the words under his breath, translating instinctively from his seminary training. "The house is not forgotten." The phrase chilled him more than the blood. The house. Not the church, not the chapel, but the house. As if the structure itself had a memory. As if it had been waiting. Nolan stepped back and looked around. The nave, though bright with fresh paint and sunlight through new stained glass, felt smaller now. Closer. He turned back to the crew, their eyes wide and expectant. "Seal off this section," he instructed, voice calm but firm. "No one is to enter here until we speak with the bishop again." Cal cleared his throat. "He's still unconscious, isn't he?" Nolan nodded. "Yes, but I'll contact the diocesan office. They need to know, and until we figure out what's beneath these boards and why there's blood there, we treat this place like a crime scene." The term hung heavy in the air. Crime scene. In a church. Something sacred and profaned in the same breath. By noon, the workers had packed up early, leaving behind their equipment and a lingering unease. Nolan remained. He paced the chapel floor, his footsteps echoing more loudly than they should. At one point, he stood before the writing on the wall and simply stared. The phrase felt less like a warning and more like a declaration. "The house is not forgotten. Not forgotten by whom? and for what reason? That evening, rain returned, soft at first, then harder. Father Nolan returned in the chapel, despite the bishop's office instructing him to lock up and return to the rectory. He couldn't, not after what they'd found. He lit candles near the altar and sat in the front pew, eyes unfocused, whispering prayers he didn't quite remember. In the flicker of candlelight, the crucifix above the altar cast strange shadows across the walls. At one point, he thought he heard someone walk across the floor behind him. When he turned, no one was there, and yet the scent of blood still lingered. Not rot, not death, but fresh, like something wounded was still near. As the clock struck midnight, Father Nolan stood and moved toward the sacristy to retrieve a relic prayer book he remembered from his trainings, something about exorcism rites and house cleansings. But just as his hand touched the doorknob, a low moan came from beneath the chapel floor. Long, mournful. The morning after the moon echoed beneath the chapel floor, Father Nolan drove straight to Glendale General Hospital, the fog clinging to the windshield like ghosts, unwilling to let him pass. He hadn't slept. He couldn't. The chapel felt alive now, aware. Something under those boards wasn't just leaking blood, it was remembering. And if the phrase on the wall was true, if the house was not forgotten, then perhaps the man who first uttered, "It remembers," had more to say. Bishop Thomas Adley lay in a recovery room, pale beneath white sheets, oxygen tubes arching into his nostrils, monitors blinking softly beside him. The nurse at the desk had warned Father Nolan that the bishop was still weak, but conscious. 5 minutes, she had said, her voice low, her eyes curious. Inside, the bishop turned his head slightly when Nolan entered, his expression a mixture of fatigue and wariness. "Father Nolan," he rasped, his voice dry. "You stayed in the chapel last night." Nolan nodded, pulled a chair close. "I heard something, Your Grace. We all did. And we found blood, fresh, under the floorboards. There's something else, too, a message in Latin. Domus non oblita est." The bishop's eyes fluttered closed, his breath shallow. "I had hoped," he whispered, "that it would never wake." "Wake?" Nolan leaned forward, his voice tense. "You knew, didn't you? About the chapel, about what happened there?" For a long time, Bishop Adley didn't respond. Then, slowly, he opened his eyes and looked directly at Nolan. "In 1969, he began. I was 12 years old. I served at St. Irenaeus as an altar boy. There was a retreat that summer, 4 nuns, 2 priests, and a group of us children. The chapel wasn't in disrepair then. It was beautiful, alive. But something happened during that retreat, something no one ever spoke of again." Nolan remained still, absorbing each word like pieces of a long-buried confession. "What happened?" he asked quietly. The bishop's face tightened with the pain of memory. "There was an accident, that's what they called it. A collapse, they said. The crypt ceiling caved in. Only I came out." "You were the only survivor?" "Yes," the bishop said, "and even that felt wrong. I don't remember escaping. I remember waking up outside, covered in dust and blood, with the bell still ringing." Nolan felt a chill crawl down his spine. But why was none of this ever documented? Why does the church archive say the chapel was closed for structural issues? Nothing more. Bishop Adley turned his head away, looking out the window at the mist-shrouded hills. "Because they made it disappear. The diocese. They buried it." "Who is they?" "The bishop before me, Bishop Lowell, the chancellor, maybe even the Vatican. I don't know how far it went, but after the incident the church replaced every record. I tried once, years later, to find the names of the nuns who were there. They were gone, erased." Nolan's thoughts raced. "And the others? The priests? The children? Dead." "All of them, except me." "So why were you spared?" Adley closed his eyes again. "I've asked myself that for 50 years. I thought perhaps it was divine mercy." "Or parchment." "And the blood," Claire proceeded. "The message?" "The chapel is remembering," Adley said. "It's not just a building. It holds things. Pain, memory, grief, and maybe guilt." Nolan sat back, reeling. "I tried," Adley said, "but no one wanted to hear. I was a child, Later, when I became a priest, I buried it, like they taught me. I convinced myself it was a dream, but when I saw that crucifix again, I knew. You recognized it? It belonged to Sister Helena, Adley whispered. She wore it the night before the collapse. She was leading us in prayer. His voice faltered, and tears welled in the corners of his eyes. She screamed, and then the floor cracked. Nolan felt the breath leave his body. A memory that vividly come from a dream. It came from trauma. Real, buried, raw. We need the real records, he said. The originals. The truth. They won't be in the diocesan archives, Adley said bitterly. Those were scrubbed clean, but there may be copies. Where? My predecessor, Adley replied. Father Jerome. He was one of the few who didn't agree with the cover-up. He kept his own records. He had a cottage outside the city. Everything may still be there if no one destroyed it. Nolan stood, heart pounding. I'll go. As he turned to leave, Adley reached out, his hand trembling. Be careful, he said. The chapel has awakened. It won't stop with blood. Nolan nodded once, then left the room, the bishop's words echoing behind him. Outside, the rain had returned, cold and unrelenting. He dialed the diocesan archivist from the car. Father Camden, he said, do you have access to records from the 1960s, specifically St. Irenaeus? There was a pause. That location was decommissioned decades ago, Father. There's nothing left. Are you sure? Yes, all entries show generic building closure. There's nothing else. What about missing persons reports? Retreat rosters? Nothing. Are you telling me there's no record of a single nun, priest, or child involved in a summer retreat in 1969? I'm telling you, the archivist replied, that as far as the church is concerned, that event never existed. Nolan ended the call in silence. The car interior felt smaller now, as if the air itself had thickened. He started the engine and headed toward the outskirts of the city, toward a small cottage hidden in the trees, hoping that someone, anyone, had dared to remember what the church had tried so hard to forget. By the time Father Nolan arrived at the cottage Bishop Adley had mentioned, the sun was beginning to dip behind the jagged treetops, casting long shadows over the moss-covered roof and cracked stone walkway. The house looked untouched for years, its front door swollen from rain and time, its windows clouded by dust. He found the spare key where the bishop had described, beneath a rusted Virgin Mary statue in the flower bed. Inside, the air was stale and damp, the scent of old paper and mildew saturating every breath. It took him an hour of searching through boxes stacked in the back room before he found the first set of files labeled St. Irenaeus, 1969. Yellowed pages, handwritten notes, and photocopies of names filled several folders, all of which contradicted the official diocesan records. But it was the photographs that made Nolan stop breathing for a moment. One of them showed a group of altar boys standing before the old altar, with Bishop Adley, then a child, standing to the far right. Beside him stood a woman in a dark habit, her face serene, her hand on his shoulder. The back of the photo was labeled Sister Helena, Summer Retreat. Nolan traced the name with his thumb, remembering the bishop's voice trembling when he had spoken of her. As he packed the documents into a waterproof bag, he couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't alone in the cottage. The floorboards creaked, once, then twice, as though footsteps circled just outside the room. He paused, waited, then whispered a prayer under his breath before heading back to the chapel. By the time he returned to St. Irenaeus, it was well past midnight. The grounds were dark except for the faint glow from the street lamp by the gate. The chapel doors were locked, the building silent, exactly as he had left it. Or so he thought. What Father Nolan didn't know was that someone else had returned earlier that evening. Or rather, not someone, but something. Mateo, the youngest of the painting crew, had left his phone charger in the chapel's storage room. Not wanting to bother Father Nolan or wait until morning, he had used a spare key kept by the site supervisor to quietly let himself in. He moved quickly, flicking on the flashlight on his phone and heading to the far corner of the nave where the charger had fallen behind an old cabinet. As he retrieved it, he paused, hearing what sounded like Salve Regina. Mateo froze. The building was locked. He was alone. The flashlight trembled in his grip. Slowly he panned the light across the nave. Empty pews. Still air. But the song continued, haunting, pure, like the voice of someone who had never stopped praying. Without thinking, he opened his camera and began recording, trying to capture the sound. The light flickered once, and in that moment his phone caught a glimpse of something else, a figure, barely visible in the shadows near the altar. A woman in a habit, standing motionless with her back turned. Mateo gasped, stumbled, and ran. He didn't stop until he was back outside, panting in the cold air, his heart thudding against his ribs like a drum. He didn't speak of it until the next morning, when he showed the video to the rest of the crew and to Father Nolan. The priest took the phone with trembling hands, replayed the footage in silence. Though the image was grainy and distorted by low light, there was no mistaking it. The outline of a nun. Her habit was long and dark, the veil hanging low. She faced the altar, unmoving as if in eternal vigil. "I know that habit," Nolan whispered. "I saw it in the photographs from the cottage. That's Sister Helena." The crew exchanged uneasy glances. "But she died in '69, Lena said, her voice barely audible. "Didn't she?" "She disappeared," Nolan corrected, "along with everyone else." He stood, closing the door to the vestry behind him. "From this moment forward, no one enters this chapel alone. Not until we understand what's happening." That night, Cal, the carpenter, took his toolbox home early. He lived close to the chapel, in a small house overlooking the west side of the property. Around 2:17 a.m., he sat upright in bed, awakened by something he couldn't name. At first, he thought it was a dream. Then he heard it again. A soft chorus, rising and falling like waves. Gregorian chant, impossible. The chapel was locked, empty, and dark. But the singing continued. He opened his window and leaned out. The sound was clearer now. Notes of Ave Maristella drifted through the night air, carried on the breeze like a secret too long kept. Cal dressed and walked toward the chapel, drawn by something he didn't understand. But the doors were still chained. No lights, no movement, only the song. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, it stopped. The silence that followed was unbearable. He turned back toward home. The image of that silent, empty building burned into his mind. The next morning, Nolan convened a meeting with the crew. "Something is trying to speak to us," he said. "This is Sister Helena. She was there in 1969. The bishop remembered her. I found her name in the missing records." He held up Mateo's phone. "And now she's been seen again." "Do you believe in ghosts, Father?" Lena asked, arms crossed tightly. Nolan hesitated. "I believe in souls, and some of them aren't at rest." No one argued. The silence was louder than any prayer. The chapel sat heavier in the earth now, as if the layers of memory that had long lain dormant were beginning to rise, pushing against the walls with invisible pressure. After reviewing the footage of Sister Helena again and confirming her identity with the old photos from Bishop Adley's recovered archive, Father Nolan instructed the team to halt all construction and restoration indefinitely. The workers obeyed without hesitation, grateful for a reason not to return. Still, something gnawed at Nolan. The visions, the chants, the blood, they weren't just random phenomena. They were signs, pieces of something darker, structured, and purposeful. The answers wouldn't come from modern records or rational analysis. They had to go back, to the moment it all went wrong. He spent the next 3 days in the chapel's rectory, a space that had not been touched since the '70s. Layers of dust clung to every surface. Books lined the sagging shelves, some in Latin, others handwritten in ink faded by time. It was behind a false wall in the priest's study, disguised as a panel in the back of a wardrobe, that Nolan found the journal. The leather was cracked, the binding broken, and the first several pages were water-stained and illegible. But deeper into the book, the entries became clearer. The name on the inside cover was Father Augustine Rain. Nolan recognized it instantly from one of the archive documents Bishop Adley had recovered, the retreat director in 1969. He began reading. The early entries were mundane, filled with notes on homilecy, confessions, and gardening updates. But on July 12th, the tone changed. "The children are afraid," it read. "Sister Helena says they wake screaming of fire and screaming faces. I hear whispers in the nave after dark. I have locked the sacristy twice this week, yet the candles relight themselves each night. July 14th, it is no longer wise to deny what we see. A shadow has fallen over the chapel. I have found animal bones buried beneath the altar. There is something here that should not be. July 16th. I have begun preparations. The diocese has not responded. The rites I must use are forbidden, but I have no choice. We will attempt it tomorrow. God forgive us. Nolan closed the journal and let the weight of it settle into his chest. An unauthorized exorcism. No record of it in church logs, no clearance from the Vatican. That alone could explain the cover-up. But more than that, it raised a darker question. What if the ritual had failed, or worse, succeeded in part? That night, as he sat in the rectory, trying to transcribe more of the damaged entries, a knock sounded at the front door. It was soft, hesitant. Outside stood a young priest, rain-soaked and carrying a duffel bag. "Father Nolan?" he asked. "I'm Father Gabriel Dumas. I've just been reassigned here from St. Matthew's. The diocese said to report to you." Nolan blinked. "I wasn't told anyone was coming." Gabriel offered a half-smile. Apparently the bishop arranged it before his collapse. Nolan nodded, ushering him inside. The young priest looked barely 30, clean-shaven, eyes alert but shadowed with something unsaid. As they settled into the kitchen, Nolan poured him tea and explained briefly what had transpired. Gabriel listened intently, then grew visibly pale when Nolan mentioned the blood, the singing, and Sister Helena's appearance. "You're not the first to feel this place waking up," Nolan added gently. "Have you noticed anything?" Gabriel was quiet for a moment, but then he said, "Before I even arrived, I began having dreams. I thought they were stress or nerves, but now I'm not so sure." "What kind of dreams?" Nolan asked. Gabriel clasped his hands tightly, knuckles whitening. "I saw a stone floor slick with blood, hands reaching from beneath it, clawing upward. I heard a voice, female, crying, 'Save me, please, save me!' And then a scream, so loud it cracked the air." Nolan's breath caught. "Did you ever serve near here before?" "No," Gabriel said, shaking his head. "I've never been within 100 miles of Grendale." Nolan leaned back, the implications spiraling through his mind. "Then you're being called here. Chosen, perhaps." "By what?" Gabriel asked. "By who?" Nolan didn't answer. Instead, he stood and retrieved Father Rains's journal, placing it before the young priest. "Start reading," he said. "You'll need to know everything before we go back under the chapel." Gabriel opened the book slowly, eyes scanning the brittle lines. As he read, a gust of wind rattled the windows and the rectory lights flickered once, then twice, before stabilizing. The building groaned, or perhaps it sighed. Either way, both men turned toward the chapel, as if sensing that it had just heard its name spoken aloud. Nolan spoke without turning back. "We need to find where they performed the ritual. If it's still intact, it might be the key to understanding what remains bound here, and why it won't let go." "What if we find it?" Gabriel asked. "Then we pray," Nolan replied. "And we hope it hasn't been waiting for us to finish what they started." After 2 nights poring through Father Rains's forbidden journal, Father Nolan and Father Gabriel found themselves surrounded by more questions than answers. Though the details of the unauthorized exorcism remained vague, what was clear was the immense fear and desperation the clergy had felt at the time, their sense that something had entered the chapel not from above, but from beneath. Rains had written of a girl not named directly, only called the vessel, and of blood that called to blood. That phrase haunted Nolan as he stared at the ancient altar in the chapel the following morning, its patient worn with time but newly polished by the restoration crew. Something about the base had always seemed unusual, wider than needed, like it had been designed to cover something. Nolan approached it again with fresh eyes, this time kneeling beside it, running his hand along the carved ridges, the Latin inscriptions. That was when he saw it, a name etched faintly into the stone's lower edge, obscured by years of grime and candle wax. Clara E. Donnell. The name stopped him cold. He rushed back to the journal, flipping through the pages of witness lists and reassembled retreat rosters from Bishop Adley's recovered archives. There it was, dated July 1969, Clara Donnelly, age 9, student participant, parental sign signed by Eleanor Donnelly. Her name had never appeared in the official diocesan records. Like all the others, she had vanished into the quiet erasure of history. but someone had carved her name into the altered base, as if marking her presence where no paper dared. Nolan brought Gabriel to see it. The young priest knelt beside him, silent, and crossed himself instinctively. "That name means something," Gabriel whispered. "She was the one," Nolan replied. "A vessel, I think. Rain didn't name her, but the dates line up. And if her name is here, beneath the altar, it means whatever happened to her wasn't an accident. She was part of the ritual." That afternoon, the site foreman returned briefly to oversee equipment removal. The crew had mostly been dismissed, but one contractor, Luis Hernandez, an experienced excavation worker, was asked to dig a new trench along the eastern exterior wall of the chapel to prepare for planned drainage enhancements. Nolan hadn't yet canceled that particular order. As Luis worked, his back aching from hours under the sun, his shovel struck something harder than stone. Expecting old foundation brick, he cleared away the dirt, only to find a rectangular slab, metal, rusted but solid. He paused, heart quickening, then knelt and dug with his hands. It was a hatch, hidden beneath layers of soil and grass. No one had ever mentioned a sublevel in the chapel. He flagged Nolan immediately. Within the hour, the two priests and Luis were gathered around the now exposed entrance. Gabriel examined the metal and found a small iron latch, sealed by time. "I checked the plans from the 1920s. There's no mention of a basement." "Let's see what it's hiding," Nolan murmured. With effort, they pried the hatch open. A draft of stale, cold air escaped as the rusted hinges groaned. A steep set of stone steps led downward into the dark. Gabriel retrieved a flashlight, its beam trembling as it illuminated the descent. "I'll go first," he said, and Nolan followed close behind. The tunnel was narrow and lined with rough-hewn stone, likely dug by hand. It sloped downward and curved subtly, as if following the natural shape of the earth. The air smelled of mold and time. At the end of the passage, they found a small room, square, silent, and perfectly dry despite the underground humidity. Along the far wall rested a large wooden box, half-roted but intact. Gabriel approached it cautiously. Louise, still above ground, waited in anxious silence. When Gabriel opened the box, both priests leaned in and froze. Inside lay the brittle remains of a child, small bones, arranged with care, wrapped in what looked like the remnants of an altar cloth. A wooden crucifix had been placed on the chest, its edges worn smooth by decades underground. Nolan swallowed hard. "Clara," he whispered. "She never left." Next to the remains was a rusted tin container. Inside it were several folded pages, notes scribbled in haste. One read, "She was chosen without consent. The ritual was rushed. Something went wrong. Forgive us." Nolan sat on the stone floor, the weight of everything crashing down around him. The ritual hadn't been just desperate, it had been unethical. Clara Donnelly had been taken, perhaps willingly by her parents, or perhaps not, and used in a rite none of them understood. Harold's hand had rested. Now her bones rested in secrecy, hidden as though even death itself had been insufficient penance. "She was the vessel," Gabriel said softly, "the girl from my dreams, the hands reaching, the voice calling. She's still calling." "She's still calling." Nolan rose, determination hardening in his spine. "Then we answer. We give her a name again. We let the world know she existed. And then what? Then we find out what else they buried here. Because if Clara's remains were hidden this deeply, something worse might still be beneath us." Gabriel turned off his flashlight, the room now faintly illuminated only by light from the open hatch above. He looked to Nolan, his voice barely a whisper. "Then let's keep digging." The discovery of Clara Dunley's remains shifted everything. Father Nolan could no longer look at the chapel as merely haunted or historically tragic. It was now a sealed tomb, a stage where deliberate human choices had met supernatural consequences. Over the following days, he and Father Gabriel began piecing together more of the timeline, aided by Bishop Adley, who, though still frail, began recovering enough to offer additional memories. In a conversation held in the bishop's private quarters, away from the ears of diocesan officials, Adley confessed what he had never dared voice aloud. In his decades of service, the retreat of 1969 had never been ordinary. It had been orchestrated reluctantly, the bishop said, his voice raspy but lucid. There was another, Father Bellamy. He was older, more traditional, and obsessed with purity and divine order. He believed in ancient rites, ones the church had long abandoned or condemned. Nolan leaned forward. "What do you mean, ancient rites?" "He called them votive ascensions," Adley explained, eyes dark with memory. Her rituals meant to call down divine favor, not through prayer, but through sacrifice. He spoke of sacred blood, of souls willingly given. He thought children were closest to the divine because of their innocence. Nolan shuddered. "Clara?" "Yes, and it wasn't just her. Bellamy convinced 3 of the nuns to participate, sisters Helena, Miriam, and Katrine. He told them they were enacting a holy mystery, but they didn't understand." "None of them did," Gabrielle whispered. "And the others? The priests, the children?" "They weren't supposed to be involved," Adley said. "But something went wrong. Something answered the rite. Not from heaven." That same afternoon, Nolan and Gabrielle began exploring deeper sections of the chapel, specifically the confessional, an old narrow space behind the main altar that hadn't been used since the closure. Dust layered every surface, but when Gabriel pulled open the door to the priest's side, he noticed something odd. A small wooden compartment had been carved into the back wall, covered by a hinged panel. Inside was a cassette tape, old and brittle, wrapped in a cloth bearing a cross embroidered in black thread. They found an old player in the rectory's storage closet and inserted the tape, their hands trembling slightly. At first, only static. Then a voice emerged, worn, low, muttering in Latin, shifting occasionally to English. "Domini. Ignoscemi mea." Then silence, followed by a single phrase, fractured with the Dorian, and the voice grew louder, filled with despair. "I opened the door for darkness to walk in. I mistook power for grace. I thought I was delivering them to light, but I gave them to the void." Nolan's blood ran cold. "That's Bellamy. He recorded his confession," Gabriel whispered. "Why hide it here?" "Because he knew the church wouldn't forgive him," Nolan replied. "But he needed someone to hear it. Someday," the recording continued. He screamed. The air bled. The child should have lived. I marked her in error. She was too young. The nuns, they cried, they begged. Helena tried to stop me, so I gave her to the fire. They all went into the fire." "Not enough," he said hoarsely. "He murdered them. He used religion as a mask for a blood ritual." Gabriel sat back, visibly shaken. "Then the spirits we're sensing, the apparitions, aren't haunting because of unfinished business. They're trapped, bound by violence they never chose. And by lies," Nolan added. "The church never acknowledged any of this. They let Bellamy die a priest, buried with honors." Meanwhile, Claire and the others rot beneath the chapel. That evening, as the sun vanished behind the tree line and the chapel was cloaked in shadows once more, Nolan sat alone beneath the crucifix. He replayed Bellamy's voice in his mind, "I gave them to the void," and wondered if the chapel itself had become that void. Gabriel entered silently, holding another box they had recovered from the sacristy closet. Inside were old altar linens, wax-sealed documents, and a rosary made of black glass. At the bottom he found another photograph, this one undated. It showed Bellamy standing with the 3 nuns, all smiling stiffly. Behind them, carved faintly into the chapel wall, was a sigil neither priest recognized. Gabriel held it closer. "It matches something I saw in Range's journal," he said. Page 32, Nolan fetched the journal, flipped to the caption. Sigil was there, hand-drawn in charcoal, beneath the caption, "Seal of the Watcher." "What is that?" Gabriel asked. Nolan didn't answer immediately. He traced the lines with his finger, and for the first time since arriving, felt something not just wrong, but watching. The air around them tightened, and a whisper, soft as breath, slid across the chapel stones. "He is still here." In the days that followed the discovery of Bellamy's confession and the photograph bearing the sigil of the Watcher, the atmosphere in St. Irenaeus changed palpably. The chapel seemed to breathe now, slow and heavy, like something asleep but aware, something waiting to be acknowledged. Father Nolan, Father Gabriel, and Bishop Adley agreed there had to be a response, not just to uncover history, but to offer redemption, both for the victims. It was Gabriel who first suggested a prayer vigil. "If we bring the names into the light," he said, "if we call them, honor them, they might hear. They might finally let go." They gathered at midnight, just as the moon rose above the pine line. The chapel remained locked to the public, but inside, beneath flickering candlelight and heavy incense, the three men knelt over the spot where the blood had first been discovered weeks before. It had since been sealed temporarily with glass, revealing the red stain like an open wound in the floor. They began the rosary slowly, alternating Latin and English, invoking Mary, the saints, and every name they had recovered from the journals. Clara Donnelly, Sister Helena, Sister Miriam, Sister Katrine, Father Rains, even the ones they could only label unknown child, they named with reverence. The chapel creaked and groaned, but they pressed on. Gabriel's voice began to tremble during the 5th decade, but he did not stop. Then, as they entered the final Glory Be, it happened. A voice joined them, soft, feminine, amiably familiar. Amen looked up, but no one had spoken. Not them, not each other. The sound had come from just above the bloodstain. Nolan whispered, "Did you?" Gabriel nodded, wide-eyed. "It wasn't me." Bishop Addy sat back, clutching his crucifix. "It was her. One of them." The candle flames flared briefly, though no wind stirred. A gust of something unseen brushed past their faces. Not malevolent, not cold, just present. With shaking hands, Nolan opened the prayer book again, reading Psalm 23 aloud. As he finished, "And I shall dwell in the house of the Lord forever," a sound echoed faintly behind the altar. A whisper. A whisper? The next morning, exhausted but baffled, the three men met again in the rectory. They knew the vigil had touched something, stirred something deeper. But Bishop Adley had not slept. Instead, he'd lain awake until just before dawn, when fatigue finally overtook him. And with it, a dream. He described it slowly over breakfast. Voice hoarse. Was a boy again. In the chapel. But everything was ash. The walls burned black. The altar cracked down the middle. I was holding Clara's hand, pulling her up the stairs. There was fire behind us, screams, but I wasn't afraid, just certain. Nolan leaned forward, listening intently. Then what happened? "We reached the top of the stairs," Adlai said. "She stopped, said she was tired. I told her to wait. I walked out into the light. And?" He paused, trembling. "I turned. I closed the door." "From outside?" Gabriel asked. The bishop nodded. "I didn't just escape. I sealed them." In slant silence fell like a stone between them. Nolan broke it. "You were just a child." "But I did," Adlai said. "In the dream, I knew exactly what I was doing. I left them. I shut them away." Gabriel placed a hand on the bishop's shoulder. "Maybe it wasn't you. Maybe it's the chapel showing you what it remembers." Nolan added, "Or what it needs you to remember. That door, it's still there, beneath the foundation. That evening, they returned to the underground chamber where Clara's remains had been found. They followed the narrow tunnel deeper than before, past the makeshift crypt, until they reached a sealed stone archway they hadn't yet touched. It bore the sigil from the photograph, half heiresses by time but still carved with force. Nolan pressed his palm to it, whispered a prayer, and stepped back. "If we open this," he said, "we finish what was started." "And we can't do it alone." Gabriel nodded. "Then let's ask for help." That night the bells of St. Irenaeus rang for the first time in over 3 decades, and the town, still remembering what had never been spoken, began to gather. The bell of St. Irenaeus rang long and low into the night, each chime like a heartbeat echoing across the silent town. Word spread quickly. For the first time in years, the chapel would reopen not for renovation or remembrance, but for redemption. Father Nolan sent invitations only to a few: the restoration crew, members of the old congregation, and those who had quietly waited for closure without ever asking the questions they feared would not be answered. Bishop Adlai stood before the altar that night, his vestments stark white against the worn stone, the light of hundreds of candles flickering against stained glass darkened by decades of soot. Father Gabriel stood at his side, assisting, while Nolan moved quietly among the pews, welcoming those brave enough to return. As the crowd gathered in reverent silence, Bishop Adlai's voice broke through the hush, not loud, but steady and clearer than it had been in weeks. "Tonight," he said, "we speak aloud the names they buried." He began to list them, one by one, pausing between each, as though allowing the souls time to hear. Clara Donnelly, Sister Helena, Sister Miriam, Sister Katrine. Even Father Bellamy, whose name Adley spoke last, with a pause that carried both grief and fury. When the names were done, Nolan raised his hand, and the chant began. Libera me, Domine. The choir, hastily assembled from parishioners, took up the ancient Latin hymn. The chapel pulsed with a mournful cadence, each note weighted with centuries of sorrow. But as the Kyrie began to rise, something strange happened. One by one, the voices faltered, the tenors first, then the altos, then finally the sopranos. Within seconds, the entire church fell into eerie silence. No throat had tightened, no singer had dropped out willingly. It was as if sound itself had been swallowed. Father Gabriel looked to Nolan. Nolan looked to Adley. The bishop's face had gone pale, his hands clenched tightly around the altar's edge. "They're listening," he whispered. "They're waiting for me." Before anyone could speak, he turned toward the congregation. "There's more you must know. I have remembered something terrible." Nolan stepped forward, alarmed. "Your Grace, maybe now isn't, it must be now," Adley said, "or never." He took a breath, the kind that seemed to draw from his soul rather than his lungs. "I told you I escaped as a child, that I was the only one to survive. But that isn't the truth. The truth is, I was made to forget." Murmurs rippled through the chapel. The bishop raised his voice over them, and Father Bellamy's ritual failed. "I was found unconscious outside the chapel doors. But I had not fled. I had watched. I had stood in the circle. He made me chant. He made me bless the knife. He called me the seal." And then, with his fingers trembled, it had been like something I could never recall until now. His fingers trembled. It wasn't Latin. It was older, and it took everything from me. I forgot the blood, the screams, even Clara's face. They told me I had collapsed during prayer, that I had run when the quake came, but none of that was true. I was part of it, a child priest, not just a victim, a witness. A vessel, and Nolan stepped forward, placing a steady hand on the bishop's shoulder. "You were manipulated. You were a child." "But I was also the last to speak the words," Adley replied. "And now I must be the one to break them." At his signal, Gabriel lit the thurible and began swinging it gently. Smoke filled the sanctuary, the smell of myrrh and frankincense curling upward like a plea. The rite of deliverance began. It was a prayer rarely used, older than the modern rites of exorcism, reserved for places defiled, not just. Nolan's voice took the lead. "In nomine Patris, et Filii et Spiritus Sancti, we declare this place not forgotten, but redeemed." The walls groaned faintly. A chill swept through the pews. Candles flickered, some extinguishing themselves. Still they pressed on. Adley stepped to the altar, laying his palms flat on its surface. "This is where you bled," he said. "This is where you were named and erased, no more." Behind him, the doors creaked slightly, though no one had touched them. Outside, the wind rose in sudden fury, whipping branches against the stained glass windows. Then a voice echoed, not from the priests, not from the pews, but from above. High, soft, agonizingly familiar. "Amen." Every head turned upward. The choir loft was empty, the organ untouched, yet someone had spoken. Clara's voice, Gabriel whispered, "Did she?" But Nolan was already stepping forward. "She heard us." In that moment, Bishop Adley collapsed to his knees, gripping the altar as a sob tore from his throat. "Forgive me," he cried. "I left you in the dark." A gust of cold wind surged through the chapel like a breath, and all the candles blew out at once. When the wind fell silent and the candles were finally relit by trembling hands and quiet whispers, the congregation remained seated in stunned reverence, as though daring not to disturb the thin veil of peace that had just descended upon the chapel. Bishop Adley, still kneeling before the altar, raised his head with eyes rimmed red but shining with something new, clarity. Father Nolan stepped toward him, helped him to his feet without words, and for a long moment the two men simply stood together, staring down at the smooth stone where blood had once stained and secrets had once screamed. Gabriel cleared his throat softly, nodding toward the far wall, where workers had painted over centuries-old plaster just days before. The new paint, still curing, now blistered in long vertical streaks, as though something beneath it rejected the color. A faint cracking sound filled the space, subtle but persistent, like ice breaking underfoot. One of the parishioners pointed as a small flake of beige paint curled away from the surface and fluttered to the ground. Then another. And another. Within minutes, a portion of the wall had sloughed its coating like old skin, revealing not the expected blankness of plaster, but words. Words carved in sharp relief, ancient Latin etched directly into the stone. Nolan stepped forward and read aloud, his voice filled with awe. God's house has been freed. Murmurs spread, not of fear, but of wonder. Several members of the congregation fell to their knees. Others began praying, some quietly weeping. Bishop Adley reached out and touched the stone, his fingers running over the grooves, and whispered, "Thank you." Over the following days, the chapel remained closed to the public, but alive with quiet activity. Nolan and Gabriel conducted more Mass with renewed solemnity, while small groups took turns scrubbing floors, clearing debris, and restoring sacred spaces, not with paint and polish, but with reverence and intention. In one forgotten corner of the sacristy, a moldy chest was discovered, containing dozens of letters, handwritten by retreat students in 1969, never sent, never burned, preserved like echoes waiting for ears to hear them again. They spoke of homesickness, of excitement, of the thrill of being chosen to serve. Each letter was read aloud during evening vigils, and each name was recorded and remembered. It was during one of these late vigils that a woman named Mrs. Carner arrived at the chapel steps, holding the hand of a small girl. She was new in town, recently relocated after fleeing an abusive marriage. With little money and no support, she had come seeking shelter, comfort, and hope. Nolan welcomed her, offering warmth and food, and asked gently about the child. "Her name's Clara," the woman said. "She came to me through a last-minute adoption agency in New York. They said her birth mother left no records, just a first name." Gabriel, who had stepped into the narthex with tea, froze at the name. Clara. The girl looked up at him then, big gray eyes beneath dark lashes, a dimple on her left cheek, and hair the same soft brown as the photo of the child they had buried days before. Nolan knelt beside her and asked softly, "Do you like your name?" The girl nodded. "It's mine. Always has been. Do you know your birthday?" She grinned. "July 16th. Gabriel sat down slowly. Nolan whispered, "That was the date of the ritual." They didn't speak of the past to Mrs. Carter, only offered the chapel's help, and in the months that followed, little Clara became a part of the parish in a way that felt more like returning than beginning. She sang in the children's choir, and during one rehearsal, as she stood near the altar, her voice slipped into a Latin hymn none of the teachers had taught her. "Salve Regina," she sang, eyes closed, hands folded, the same melody that had once echoed through empty pews from an unseen mouth. Gabriel met Nolan's eyes across the nave. "It's her," he whispered, "or a part of her." Nolan nodded, smiling through tears. "Maybe God didn't take her. Maybe he gave her back." Bishop Akeley, now retired and living in a small room near the bell tower, often sat with Clara in the afternoons, telling her stories of saints and parables, never once speaking of 1969. But sometimes, when she reached for his hand and smiled that knowing, impossible smile, he felt the weight of his guilt lift slightly, replaced by something warmer, something like absolution. On the one-year anniversary of the ritual's undoing, the chapel reopened officially to the public. It bore no grand plaque, no modern renovations, no glossy brochures, just a single wooden sign near the entrance carved with the words they had uncovered that night. Domus Dei. Inside, light streamed through the cleaned stained glass windows in colors more vivid than anyone remembered, and the air no longer felt heavy but alive. Mass was full. Laughter returned to the courtyard. The bell rang again, and in the front row, a small girl named Clara knelt with her hands clasped, eyes bright, and whispered prayers that echoed not with sorrow, but with peace. And this time, when she said Amen, It was only her voice, and it was If this story moved you, don't forget to like and subscribe for more haunting mysteries brought back to light. I'm curious, what part of the story struck you the most? Was it the bishop's buried memory, the mysterious voice during prayer, or the little girl with the same name? And where in the world are you watching from? Let me know in the comments. I read every one.